What's going on, football fans? It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS and prop preview for Monday Night Football between the Cardinals and the Cowboys. Going to get you ready for all of your exposure tonight. But first off, a breakdown of the Draftkings slate and what we're doing for our single game lineups. That'll include a look at the injury report, some of the ownership trends that we have heading into lock. We'll talk through some lineup construction, how to correlate your lineup based on the kind of outcome that you envision happening. And then afterwards, we're going to break down the prop and the betting side of things with some underdog and prize pick props that have already gone out there and mixed in to help you out with some of your exposure. So by the end, you'll have a complete game plan for everything tonight. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop on in. First thing to note would be the spread and the over-under. And first off, the spread would be 3.5 points favoring Dallas. So they're expected to win this game in most cases. And because of that, ownership is going to be slightly higher on them. Nothing drastic though. It's not like a 5 to 7 point spread where it could be a 10 to 15% ownership difference. Probably closer to that 3 to 5% range tonight, but still something to at least note. But more importantly, the lineup constructions where you're going to see that bigger difference. You're going to see more 4-2 Dallas lineups as opposed to the 4-2 Arizona side. So that is something that you can throw into the back of the mind as well. But the other side of the game environment is arguably even more important than the spread, because we got ourselves a 54.5 point over under, one of the highest totals that we've had in all of 2025. At any time the public sees that kind of an over under, they play for the shootout script. And in a shootout script, you see a lot of 3-3s. A 4-2 Dallas lineup might be mixing in there as well, but a lot of 2 quarterback lineups, a lot of lineups with 3, even 4 pass catchers that you're jamming in alongside with them, a lack of running backs, a lack of defenses, a lack of kickers, and a lack of possession tight ends towards the bottom end of the board is where you can find some of your leverage. And that's what I'm expecting for this evening, is that for people to go for that shootout kind of a script, which could end up being the case. And all of us as NFL fans want to see that kind of a game. And I think that's why the ownership gets even higher on that kind of outcome than it probably should. But if you're playing the smart game theory game and trying to, get different to the rest of the field, it's the play of 4-2 or a 5-1 in either direction. That's a little bit more rushing based. And in my large field GPP exposure, and because I don't really have a massive lean tonight, I agree with the spread. I think Dallas should be slightly favored in this kind of matchup. But in my opinion, both of these teams are middle of the road, maybe even, bottom end teams when it comes to the league. So it could really go either direction in my opinion. So that's why I'm going to be playing in the large field GPPs, going for some of those outside outcomes. If you do agree that it's going to be a shootout, it's going to be a super close game, then maybe playing some cash and single entries, because that is going to be unbelievably popular tonight. And if you plan on doing that in large field GPPs, you're going to be running into a whole lot of duplicates. But let's start with CeeDee Lamb at $10,800. He's got nearly a 2x points per dollar projection, and the main thing to note is the starting price tag. He's only $10,800. And if this was week 1 or week 2, you'd be questioning only $10,800. But over the last couple weeks, we've had guys that are nearly $13,000 at the top. So a $10,800 price tag is actually a lot softer than what we're used to seeing, and why he's still a very solid play at the top end of the board. And even a Dak Prescott at $10,400, he's projecting for over a 2.1x points per dollar value. And even in the middle to the bottom end of the board, we've got guys in that 2 to 2.5x mark. So in cash and single entries, there are some just very obvious plays that you're going to be getting to for tonight. For example, Jacoby Brissett is 2.3x, but even towards the bottom, like a Michael Wilson 2.3, a Devontae Turpin is a 3x value, 3.2x on Elijah Higgins at the tight end position. There are spots where you can open up all the salary that you're hoping for, and because your spend ups aren't 12.5 or even close to $13,000, you can use a spend up at captain if you want to as well. And the value towards the bottom, that's in that 2 to 2.5x range, is going to open up a lot of that flexibility up towards the top end of the board. So that shootout game script where you're playing both quarterbacks, a CeeDee Lamb captain or a Trey McBride captain, one of these elite pass catcher options on either team, is going to be super easy to fit in. So that's going to further lead into that chalk that we're mentioning right off the bat, which is why you have to be really careful about your lineup construction. And personally, CeeDee Lamb is not my favorite captain for this evening. He's going to be extremely highly owned. In fact, the highest owned captain that we have at about 16% ownership. And I would say that his red zone upside is lower than some of the other pass catchers that we have on the slate, most notably a Trey McBride, who's finally started to score over the last couple games. A George Pickens, of course, is maybe the best red zone threat that we have in the NFL. As a former Steeler fan, I'm willing to say that about Pickens. I'm salty that he's no longer on our team, but in terms of a jump ball guy, there's really nobody else that I would rather have. So CeeDee Lamb, a solid flex play in my exposure for tonight, but I'm not so much sure about that captain spot. But a Dak Prescott at 2.1x points per dollar value will be making my captain exposure. And it's worth noting that because Dak Prescott is mostly a passing quarterback, he does have some rushing upside hidden in there, a little bit less than when he first started his career, but every once in a while he'll spring off something for 10 to 20 yards because he's mostly mostly passing heavy though. We want him with at least one pass catcher in every single case. And if I'm going to use him at captain, it's 2 or 3 pass catchers that I'm using along with the Dak Prescott, because if he's going to score the 25 points or so that's necessary for being the optimal captain, that's 3, maybe even 4 touchdowns if he's getting closer to a 30-point performance. And that's going to drag along at least 2 of those 3 players along with him. So that's why I'm going with that with my lineup construction, a little bit of correlation there. If you do plan on using CeeDee Lamb at the captain position, I would most likely pair him up with Dak Prescott at flex. And a lot of times it'd be difficult to do that if the pricing was a little bit more stringent, but because it's a bit softer for this matchup and this 55-point over-under, it is much more doable to play those 2 together. Next up, we got Javonte Williams. So it is 3 Dallas players to start. So not only are the Cardinals slightly lower owned because they are the underdogs tonight, but they're also a lot more affordable across the board. But a Javonte Williams, before we get to that Arizona side, is at $10,000. He's got a 1.8x points per dollar projection, which is the lowest of all of these spend ups. So he's a quote unquote bad play, I guess we'd say, but 1.8x points per dollar value would be more than acceptable on any other slate that we've had this year. So don't sleep on him entirely, especially if you're going to some of those more contrarian game stacks where you're playing a Javonte Williams captain, pairing him up with maybe a Dallas defense at the flex position and hoping that it's more of an onslaught build where the Cowboys finally get it figured together out in defense, continue to do the thing on the offensive side of the ball. If they win by 2 to 3 touchdowns, and that is a very realistic outcome tonight. I could see it going either direction. I could see Arizona doing the very same thing. I think this is much closer to a coin flip and a much more volatile coin flip than most people would expect. That guys like Javonte Williams would really make sense in some of those Dallas heavy lineups. So you can see at captain, I'm only using them in my 4-2 lineups or my 5-1 Dallas builds. And that's what you get with the script dependent tab, is not only who I'm using with the player pool tabs that are blacked out over here. Of course, guys, these projection sheets can be found on my Patreon page. The NFL DFS tier is how you get access to everything that you're seeing on there. But when I'm using somebody like a Javonte Williams at captain, I'm thinking about the kind of game script that I'm building for. And you can see over here, it's for some of those onslaught kind of builds. So it's not just who you're playing that you should be thinking about when going through the player pool and trying to figure out your exposures. It's how you're going to be deploying them at the very same time. And you can do this when building by hand. You can make sure that you have that correlation. Or of course, what I do when I'm building is I set roles in my optimizer. I'll make sure that I have an if statement. If Javonte Williams captain is in my lineup, then I want at least 4 players from Dallas, right? That's how I can force in those 4-2s or those 5-1s. A Trey McBride at $9,000 is the first player that we have on the Cardinals, and in my opinion is my favorite captain that you have on that team, because he's got red zone upside. If he scores twice, that would be his way to the optimal lineup, and he's got a 2x points per dollar projection, which is the second best points per dollar mark that we've seen so far, just behind Dak Prescott's 2.1x mark, and he's about 50% combined owned, which is spot in line with guys like a Javonte or CeeDee Lamb. So it's not like he's a massive ownership discount compared to those 2 players, but he is a discount from the actual price perspective, like a literal discount from an $1,800 difference at CeeDee Lamb, also a $1,000 difference from a Javonte Williams. And you can see, especially from like a Williams down to a McBride, it's only a 0.6 point difference from player to player. So a Trey McBride is personally my favorite spend up if we're trying to get to, a slightly more contrarian stack on the Arizona side of things. A George Pickens, I also like at the captain spot. Unlike a CeeDee Lamb, who's extremely expensive, if you're going to use him at captain, he's a little bit more realistic down there at $13,200. And he also, like we were mentioning off the bat, has a bit more red zone upside. And in my captain plays, I want guys that could score a touchdown or 2 that can get us to the 20 to 25 points. And if you are playing for the shootout, close script, that chalkier build that we were mentioning before, you're probably going to need somebody that scores 2 touchdowns. If it's going to be like a 60-point over-under when it's all said and done, right? If it's going to go over that total, and that's the kind of script that you're playing for, the Pickens, the McBrides are the best captains that you can get to in that sort of scenario. And it's easy to imagine because of the kind of red zone upside that both of those sort of players have. Those kind of guys, or the quarterbacks, are the best kind of captains in that scenario. Speaking of quarterbacks, we got Jacoby Brissett at $8,600, and he's got the best points per dollar projection that we have on the slate, at least for the spend ups. You've got some wonky numbers towards the very bottom end end of the board. But for guys that have a legit price tag for Monday Night Football, Jacoby Brissett's your guy. And, he's been very efficient, as I mentioned off the bat as well. He is going to be 66% owned, though, so that's the one downside to using him in your lineups. But if you're going with an Arizona heavy build and you're not just building for the 3-3 or the Dallas 4-2 with Brissett plus one pass catcher, you can get a low-owned combination there. And although Brissett might be 66% owned, if you use him at captain, let's say, which I'm not planning on doing right now, but if I did use him at the captain spot and you paired him up with 3 other pass catchers, that lineup construction of having a 4-2 or even a 5-1, if you took it a little bit further towards the Arizona side, that lineup construction is going to be utilized in sub 5% of builds, I'd imagine, for tonight. A 4-2 is going to be a little bit more utilized, probably closer to like 15 to 20%. It's going to be quite substantially higher owned, but even then, it's 15 to 20% compared to the other sides of the game. So it might be even closer to 10 to 15% that we have on that sort of utilization. But the other side of the game, you're going to have double, even triple utilization on the 3-3s and the 4-2 Dallas lineup. So that's why I'm not going to be sleeping on guys like Jacoby, but in cash lineups, he's a borderline lock because of that 2.3x points per dollar projection, and also because he's only $8,600. He's about the average salary if you're throwing him into a lineup, which means you don't have to spend up to jam him in. In fact, you could use him at captain in your cash lineups, and I think that would make a whole lot of sense because regardless of Arizona winning or playing from behind, you have to think that Brissett's going to be a huge part of that. If they're playing from ahead, they might be running the ball a little bit more in the second half, but he does have that rushing aspect to him at that quarterback position. But if they're going to get that lead, it's mostly because of him playing well in the first half, you'd have to think. And then if they're playing from behind, of course, and they have to throw the ball to try and catch up, that would lead to some extra second half usage there too. So that's why I think in cash, he is a borderline cash lock, like you can see in the extra player notes here towards the right, which by the way are not completed yet. By the time we get to lock, pretty much every single player, and if not every player, like everyone but 1 or 2 players, will have an extra player note here towards the right side, and that's whether I'm using them in my lineups or not. I give you guys an idea of the pros and cons to getting to all of these plays, ownership, whether the price is too high or too low, all that sort of jazz over there. And a lot of times, even though I don't play a lot of cash myself, that's why I don't have like a cash player pool tab per se, I will give my opinion on them on cash towards the right side. So another reason to check out the Patreon page and of course the NFL DFS tab. But yeah, Jacoby Brissett's as close to a cash lock as you could possibly get. Let's talk about these other mid-tier options now with a Marvin Harrison Jr. and a Jake Ferguson. Both of them are a little bit more expensive than they probably should be, hence why they're at 1.5 and 1.6x points per dollar value. But on most slates, these really wouldn't be all that notable, so still worth mixing in. And I would say because of the fact that it is a slate with a 54.5 point over-under, and these guys have some red zone upside, like especially in GPPs at sub 6% at captain on Marvin Harrison, a sub 4% owned captain on Jake Ferguson. Both of them could be leverage pieces to get different within those chalkier game scripts. And what I mean by that is if you want to play for the shootout, the close 3-3 or something like that, I think the best way to do so and to not duplicate yourself with 1,000 other people tonight would be to leave a little bit of efficiency on the table. You're not getting quite the full 2x points per dollar that we're getting at some of the other guys towards the top, but you leave that efficiency on the table and you get that differentiation at captain. I think that's at least worth exploring. A lot of people are going to be using these two at the flex position instead, but what if they end up scoring a touchdown and getting 100 yards? Like that would be their way to the optimal. Maybe Ferguson has another like 7 to 8 catch game. Don't sleep on that kind of an outcome. Next up, we got Zonovan Knight at $7,000. He's projecting as the #1 running back for Arizona. Michael Carter's kind of relinquished that role to Zonovan because of some of the recent production, but they've said they're going to run with the hot hand. So I'm expecting him to get like 60% of the touches, maybe closer to 55%. Michael Carter's probably going to get like 30 to 35%. And then maybe they have a few other guys, even wide receivers, taking up some of the other running usage. But it's mainly Zonovan that you're going to want for Arizona at that position. And if they're playing from ahead and you're playing for a 4-2 or a 5-1 towards them, then he's a fantastic player to use in lineups. Now, would I be using him at the captain position? I'm not sure I'm quite that bullish on his chances personally. Like I said, I think Dallas is more than likely should be the favorite for this sort of game. But if you are somebody that's a little bit more optimistic about Arizona, maybe even a Cardinals fan yourself, you could throw him in at captain, pair him up with a Cardinals defense / special teams, and get some extra correlation that way. Next up, we have these two kickers in Aubrey, a Ryland at $5,400. $4,400 and $5,000 respectively, both at 1.8x points per dollar projection. I slightly prefer the kickers that are on the favorites, so that's going to push me towards an Aubrey, especially because he's probably the best kicker that we have in the NFL. But both of them, especially because Ryland has an 8.9 point projection, are going to be making lineups for me. And a lot of people will be using the pass catchers, the quarterbacks, but in high total games, that also means that there's going to be more field goals and more point after touchdown attempts as well, which is massive for these kind of projections. They have a Michael Carter next at $4,400. He's still projecting solidly because he's super cheap at $4,400 at 1.9x points per dollar projection, but at 20% total ownership, it's not really like there's a lot of leverage to be had there. So as is, I'm personally going to be under the field if I'm using him at all, and as of at least right this second, he's currently not in my player pool. Zay Jones at $4,000. He's had a couple big plays this season, but he's not playing as much as some of the other wide receivers. A more reliable value play for Arizona would be a Michael Wilson, who's projecting as a better points per dollar play. The reason for that is more of a PPR threat, more of that possession wide receiver, and because he's cheaper, he's $800 cheaper than Zay Jones, and he has that higher floor, he's the player that I'll be using a little bit more often. But don't sleep on guys like Zay Jones and GPPs. If he gives you that big play touchdown, that would be his way to the optimal lineup. Next up, we got a Cowboys defense at $3,800. They're not projecting very well at all because of the 55 point total, 1.5x points per dollar efficiency. But if you are playing for some of those lower percentage outcomes, you're going for a Dallas 5-1 with like a Javonte Williams captain exposure, then what if the Cowboys defense turns a turnover into a touchdown? I mean, they've got some legit playmakers on that defensive side of the ball. Kevontae Turpin, don't sleep on him either. And speaking of Kevontae Turpin, he's going to be a really good value play when we get down here to $2,000. But if Kevontae Turpin returns a touchdown, either on a punt or a kickoff return, then that's going to double count if you're playing the Cowboys and Turpin together. So that's going to be some correlation that I'm exploring in some spots. But a return touchdown is something rare that we don't see very often during the NFL season. So it's not something that you're going to want to do in every single case. More of the correlation for me is going to be between the, Javonte captain exposure and then what I'm going with the Cowboys defense. Jalen Tolbert at $3,600 is only a 0.5x points per dollar projection. Not the best play, especially if you're in some cash or some of your like single entry lineups. But he could get there with a big play. He could get there with a touchdown as well. And he's at least playing snaps for the Cowboys. Not as much now that you have CeeDee Lamb, George Pickens in the mix. Kevontae Turpin really starting to stick out, but not somebody that you want to completely eliminate from your consideration. Next up, we have a Cardinals defense. They're only $3,400. They're yet another team that you can mix in to get a little bit of differentiation. In particular, if you're going with that Arizona lid onslaught, I'm not personally massive on those sort of lineups tonight. So once again, if you're more bullish about them, mix in a little bit more Zonovan Knight than I am. Mix in a little bit more Cardinals defense than I am into your exposure, and you could easily get some differentiated lineups that way. We already mentioned Michael Wilson before. He's probably the best value play that we have in this 3 to 4K range at 2.3x points per dollar projection. And Amari DiMercado, he's expected to play a little bit for Arizona, but probably as running back 3, but he is a bit of a third down back, so he has some receiving upside, especially if they're playing from way behind. He may get a little bit extra playing time in that kind of scenario because he's a good blocker and has some decent hands. Ryan Flournoy, he's actually started to play a little bit more than Tolbert, so that's why he's at a 3.5 raw point projection as opposed to 1.7 points for Tolbert. And I think you're going to see that continue to grow as the season goes on. He's got a little bit more upside. He's got an extremely good physical skill set. He's extremely fast, shifty at that sort of position, so he could turn a slant into a big play in just a hurry. So I like that kind of upside for the large GPPs, and probably somebody that makes a few lineups for me tonight. Greg Dortch, the torch. He's maybe not so much the torch anymore as he started to slow down, but a really good possession wide receiver for Arizona these days. Does return some kicks and punts for them, though. He's still shifty, even though he maybe doesn't have the top end torch speed as he used to have. He's still somebody that, if he returns a touchdown, could get you some extra points there. We mentioned that with Turpin earlier, but even as just a regular wide receiver / running back option, is going to get some gadget plays for Dallas. And if he takes one of those for a big play or a touchdown, that would be his way to the optimal there, let alone his chances to return a kick or a touchdown as well. Luke Schoonmaker, he's been playing quite a bit for Dallas this year as well. He's technically their tight end 2, and because they run a lot of 2 tight end sets, especially when playing from ahead, he's somebody that I'll be throwing into a couple builds because of that red zone upside. Jadon Blue could get some extra run if Dallas is playing from way ahead. If it's a true onslaught, a 3 to 4 touchdown lead like what we had with the Seahawks last night, Jadon Blue would would potentially be able to get there that way. And Elijah Higgins at tight end, he plays for the Arizona Cardinals. He's got a 3.2x points per dollar projection. He's somebody that I'll be throwing into builds, especially because he's only $1,000. And let's use some of the more expensive captains that we have on the slate. We have a Brevin Spanford. He's more of a blocking tight end for Dallas, but he does at least play. And then though Hunter Lepke is listed as a running back, he's a fullback for Dallas. So he will be playing quite a bit. He does have a 3x points per dollar projection, but that's because he's only $400. So, like I said, it gets kind of wonky when we get here towards the bottom. Like, that's why a Higgins, a blue, they're only projecting for like 3.2 or 3.8 raw points in the case of a Jadon Blue, but it's not necessarily what you're getting with those players towards the bottom. If they score a touchdown, they get close to 10 points. That would be fantastic, right? From any of those players that we have here towards the bottom, but it's what it lets you get at the other positions. Lets you get a super expensive captain. Lets you spend up for both quarterbacks if you want to go with that chalkier kind of game script. So there's a time and place for getting to some of these punts towards the bottom, but they're going to have some ownership, like especially with the case like a Turpin. Michael Wilson is going to be about 20% owned at that flex position. So that's where the guys like a Higgins, a Jadon Blue, where you're truly playing for an outside game script, can give you some of that leverage towards the bottom. And because I'm playing in the large GPPs and I'm personally going to be trying to get different with all my exposure, these are the players that you're going to see me a little bit heavier on. So a Blue is going to be making some of my Dallas heavy lineups, a Higgins making some of my Arizona heavy lineups to try and give myself a slightly different look at the rest of the field. And now for the prop on the betting side, where I've got a couple pieces of exposure that you might want to tail for yourself. And let's start with this Trey McBride over on receiving yards, who is still at 66.5 on Underdog, which is one of the few books that hasn't bumped him to 69.5. A few books even getting him to the 70.5 plus mark, because this guy's an absolute stud, and the matchup couldn't be any better against this Dallas secondary, one of the worst defenses across the board, whether it's against the rush, the pass, quarterbacks, tight ends, you name it. They're bottom 10 in pretty much every single category. And Trey McBride is somebody that for his career averages about 10.5 yards per reception. This year is only about 9 yards per reception, and I think that's why he opened a little bit lower for this yards mark than he should have. If you look at his career baseline numbers and the fact that he's at 6.5 receptions and juiced heavily towards the over on a lot of sports books, he could be at 72.5 to even 75.5 yards. And that wouldn't be the case for every single week, especially against like a tougher defense or expected to be like a lower paced game. But this is a 54.5 point over under. This is, again, maybe the worst defense that we have in all of the NFL, with all the injuries that they have on the defensive side of the ball. As the year goes on and they get healthier, I don't expect them to be nearly as poor as what we've seen so far, but for the time being, they're a spot that we're going to use to attack from fantasy and for prop purposes like this. And Trey McBride at any sort of value compared to the other sports books is going to be one of my first leans of the week, because he's just an absolute stud. As we mentioned, he's really started to come into his own, finally started to score over the last month or so as well. But at 66.5 receiving yards, this could easily be 5, even 6 to 7 yards higher. So I'll lock that in before that kind of line movement. You'll see on Prize Picks that it's already moved a bit. In fact, actually moved back down to 66.5. So that's pretty good stuff right there that we'll be able to lock in. And we'll mix it in with this Brian Anger prop if you want to get a pairing over there. But there's been a few line movements across these different sports books. I actually took this as the props that we're about to go through. We're going to be 3 different props that we're mixing in. I took them as a 3-man on Prize Picks for a 6x payout, but because they've bumped them and moved them around, you'd have to take them as 2 separate slips. And maybe there's a site like Underdog or Prize Picks that you prefer, that you have your bankroll on, that you're actually using for your day-to-day exposure. Just pick the one that makes the most sense for you. I probably wouldn't double up on the exposure if you have access to both. That's just the PSA I'm going to give you guys right now. If you do a half unit a piece, and here's the reason for that, without going too into the weeds about overexposure and whatnot, is when you have Trey McBride in both slips, like we're going to have here in both cases, because of the different line movements that have happened, you don't want to have a full unit on Trey McBride in both cases, because that's 2 units of Trey McBride, 1 unit a piece on the other props that you're pairing up with him. And it might not be a massive deal if it's just like 1 extra unit that you're deploying in this kind of scenario, but if you make a habit of that over the entire season and you end up going, let's say, have some bad luck on the ones that you're doubling up on, it could completely tank some of your ROI. So that's why personally, I try to diversify a little bit more. And if you're doing so, take them for a half unit a pop. But that's the Trey McBride one. And let's talk about each of these pairings. So let's go through CeeDee Lamb next for the under at 0.5 rushing plus receiving touchdowns. If you go to the sportsbook lines, you'll see that he is juiced towards the under for his 50-50 lines. And this is on Pinnacle, where you can take the yes and the no. The yes is plus 107 and the no is minus 134. And if you go to some of the other major books like Draftkings and FanDuel, FanDuel, he's plus 105 to plus 110 to score. And of course, that's only on the one-way market, so you can't even bet the no on a lot of the other sites that are out there. Draftkings will probably post the no market at some point, but for right now, that's not really available. So using the minus 134 juice, that's still a plus EV value, but there's a chance that when DraftKings posts it, it could be minus 135, minus 140 juice towards the under, and even better value than it currently is. And the traditional analysis on why a CD Lamb under touchdowns makes sense is there are just so many mouths to feed on that Dallas offense that it makes it tough to make any of them more than a 50-50 prospect to score. I mean, you've got a Pickens, a Ferguson, you've got a Tolbert, you've got a Flournoy, you've got, all those backup tight ends even, like a Schoonmaker, a Lepke could steal touchdown. You've got Javonte Williams stealing rushing touchdowns on top of that. And it's a 54.5 point total. They're expecting each team to score 3 or 4 touchdowns. But even then, I like this under on CD Lamb. So it's an even money prop. It actually gets us up to a 3.04x payout if we take those two together. It's because of some of the slight anti-correlation between these. So I thought a really good value prop to take. And then on the prize pick side, I ended up mixing it in with this Brian Anger under on punts. He's at 3.5 punts. And if we take a look at the DraftKings line for this game, it's a 6.5 total punt line, and it's minus 145 towards the under. So that has a lot to do with the total. It's at 54.5 points. Again, one of the highest totals that we've seen of the entire year. And there's been a lot of less punts in 2025. And it has to do with the rolls on the kickoff. A lot of players, a lot of teams are getting it at the 35-yard line, even the 40-yard line at times, which means they only have to get like 1, maybe 2 first downs before they're in the spot where they don't have to kick a punt. And because you have the best kicker in the NFL, Brandon Aubrey, on the Cowboys, this is the sort of situation where they could be kicking even a 65, 70-yarder at times. They're going to be punting a little bit less. And because they're on the favorites, you have that 6.5 total, minus 145 towards the under. You would expect the Dallas side to be punting a little bit less. That's why I think that this is worth mixing in. And again, I did have the CD Lamb prop available on Prize Picks. That's how I took them together for that 6x payout. But even at 3x, this is probably worth mixing in as well. So if you have access to Underdog Prize Picks, you can go with both. Again, 0.5 units is probably the best way to go about it. But for the rest of the exposure, and as soon as I'm entering it so you guys can catch anything before any potential bumps, make sure to check out my Patreon page for that. The NFL prop tier is how you get access to everything that I'm entering, both on Underdog, Prize Picks, all the different sports books that are out there, and let's have ourselves a slate. Alrighty guys, that is all I've got for the Monday Night Football preview. Best of luck with everything that you guys are going with, whether it's on the prop or the DFS side. Hope we can cash out and add to the bankroll a bit. Go ahead, smash that like button. Also subscribe so you guys don't miss any of the content to come, including our main slate previews and all the showdown breakdowns for Thursday Night Football and Monday Night Football this season, as well as all the content for golf here this fall as well. But until next time, best of luck, as I was saying before. Go ahead and comment down below who you've got as your top scorer for Monday Night Football. And if you guess the top scorer first, it'll be on a first come, first serve basis. You'll get a free month access to all my Patreon projections. That includes the DFS side, all of the props that I'm taking on Underdog and Prize Picks as well. Go ahead, guess your top player before anyone else ends up stealing them from you, and best of luck with everything for Monday. But that's all I've got, guys. I appreciate your support, as I was saying before, and see you guys for Thursday later this week.